When I stepped through the glass doors of the Lauder Hotel, that pristine shrine of old-money Southern elegance, I could practically feel the silence already pushing me out. My heels clicked against the marble like they didn't belong there, like I didn't belong there, and maybe they didn't. I had a garment bag draped over my arm, inside it the pale blush bridesmaid dress I had paid for, steamed, altered, carried through 2 airports, and now stood holding like some kind of desperate peace offering. I caught a glimpse of myself in the gold-trimmed mirror in the lobby and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Tired. Tight smile. Hair perfectly done, not a strand out of place, but none of it enough. The air inside was thick with perfume and money and some kind of quiet tension that clung to me like humidity. My father was standing near the elevators, fidgeting with his tie. Always in a suit, always adjusting something that didn't need fixing. He looked at me once, then looked away, and then back again, like maybe he hoped I'd vanish. I should have known what was coming the moment his jaw tightened. "Don't ruin her day," he said without even greeting me. He didn't say hello. Didn't ask about my flight. Didn't even notice the dress. His hand smoothed down the front of his jacket like this was just another board meeting, and not his oldest daughter arriving at her sister's wedding. "Unlike you, Haley makes us proud." That sentence landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. I didn't flinch, but only because I'd heard worse. Maybe not in those exact words, but in enough small ways over enough years that I could fill a book with them. He didn't even say it like he thought it was cruel. He said it like he thought it was fact, like it was something everyone in the room already knew and agreed on. Just another reminder that no matter how hard I worked, how much I gave, how much I paid, I would always be the disappointment. I tightened my grip on the hanger in my hand. My knuckles were white. That dress cost me $430, not including the second rush alteration when Haley decided she wanted everyone's hemlines shorter so they'd match better in the photos. I had booked the suite block for the family at a deep discount through my company, secured the welcome champagne Haley wanted, arranged a private driver for our parents, and paid the final invoice on the wedding venue when Mom casually mentioned they'd maxed out the wedding credit card. $52,000. My money. Quietly wired over after one tense call with Mom that ended with her saying, "Well, if you really want Haley to have the day she deserves," as though I would be the one ruining it if I didn't foot the bill. I didn't even get a thank you. The worst part? I hadn't expected one. That's the thing about growing up as the other daughter. You don't realize at first. You think everyone's playing the same game, that love is something you earn by doing well, being good, trying harder. But eventually you start to notice the patterns. Haley gets a B+ in school and it's framed on the fridge. I bring home straight A's and it's, "Don't gloat, Maddie." It's not polite. She gets a part in the school play? They're front row with flowers. I land a prestigious internship in New York and they tell me it's too far from home. And now, even now, with my bank account bruised and my body exhausted from 12-hour workdays followed by sleepless nights organizing other people's perfect experiences, they still look right past me. Haley was the sun in every room she walked into. Blonde, delicate, always styled just enough to look like she didn't try. She cried prettily, apologized charmingly, smiled like she expected the world to fall at her feet. And it usually did. I stood next to her at the rehearsal dinner and could see the way every guest looked at her like she was the main character in a movie they'd already seen 100 times but still adored. I was a set piece in the background. The tall one. The serious one. The sister. I walked past my father without another word. He didn't stop me. Didn't call after me. The elevator opened silently, and I stepped inside alone, clutching the dress like it might keep me grounded. I watched the numbers rise, floor by floor, and felt something twisting in my chest. I told myself I wouldn't cry, not here, not in this place where my pain would just be inconvenient noise. I thought about all the nights I'd spent hunched over my laptop, managing high-profile accounts, traveling cross-country for conferences, fixing problems that weren't mine to begin with. I'd built a career in luxury hospitality from scratch, one where people paid tens of thousands just for my advice. I'd helped couples plan weddings that made magazine covers. I'd sat in boardrooms where people twice my age asked for my approval before moving forward. And still, here, I was nothing. Not important enough to be informed of changes in the itinerary. Not included in the group chat with the other bridesmaids. Not consulted when Haley changed her color palette last minute. When I offered to help coordinate some of the vendor timelines, Haley smiled that smile that made people forgive her for being awful and said, "No offense, but we've got someone with taste handling that." Then she turned and laughed with her maid of honor, not even noticing the way my jaw clenched. But still, I showed up. Still, I paid. Still, I smiled. Still, I stood there when she twirled in her overpriced gown, surrounded by people fawning over how beautiful she looked. And she did. She always did. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe I thought if I gave enough, worked enough, supported enough, that one day someone would see me. Really see me. That one of them might stop, look at me, and think, Madison deserves this too. But I was beginning to realize that day wasn't coming. Not from them. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into the hallway and walked toward my room. There were petals scattered on the carpet, remnants of some decorator's idea of romance. I sidestepped them. I didn't have the energy to pretend this was beautiful. I unlocked the door and walked into my suite, quiet, pristine, untouched. I hung the bridesmaid dress on the back of the door and stared at it for a long time. It felt like armor. Or a costume. I wasn't sure which. I still remember the exact shoes I was wearing on my first day at the front desk of the Harrington Hotel in downtown Charleston, cheap black ballet flats that dug into the backs of my heels and left angry red lines after a 10-hour shift. My blazer didn't quite fit right, and I had to safety pin the hem of my skirt because the stitching had come undone on the train ride over. I was 20, freshly out of college with a hospitality degree I paid for entirely on my own through scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. I was one of 10 new hires that month, the only one without family connections or industry favors. I wasn't anyone's niece or neighbor or sorority sister. I was just a name on a resume and a girl who knew how to smile even when her feet were bleeding. I threw myself into that job like it was my one shot at survival. And maybe it was. I memorized every guest's name before they even walked through the lobby, learned the layout of the building down to the fuse boxes and boiler rooms, and stayed after my shifts to restock the complimentary mints when no one else bothered. I came in on my days off to shadow the assistant manager just so I could understand how the scheduling software worked. Within a year, I was offered a promotion to front desk supervisor. Another year and I was managing the entire guest services team. By 22, I was flown out to Miami to help open a sister property. By 23, I had the keys to my own hotel. By 25, I was the youngest regional director in the company's history, overseeing 14 properties spread across 5 states, managing over 600 employees, and reporting directly to the senior vice president, G. I signed off on multi-million-dollar renovation budgets, negotiated contracts with luxury vendors, ran training programs that were rolled out nationwide, and was flown in to troubleshoot underperforming branches with less than 24 hours notice. I stayed in suites I designed. I shook hands with CEOs. I gave keynote speeches at conferences where men twice my age took notes when I talked. And not once, did my parents ever ask what exactly I did for a living. When I mentioned work, it was like I'd spoken in another language. If I brought up a new property, Mom would blink and nod like she was humoring me. Dad would change the subject. When I told them I'd been named to a regional leadership council and flown to Aspen for the award, Mom's response was, "That's nice, sweetie. Did you hear Haley got engaged?" I still remember the way my stomach dropped when she said it, like my news had been a brief speed bump in the conversation they were actually interested in having. Haley had graduated with a degree in communications that she changed majors twice to get, finishing 2 semesters behind schedule. Her first job out of college was as a social media intern for a local boutique that paid in store credit. She quit after 3 months because she said the owner was toxic. After that, she bounced between marketing assistant gigs, 2 brand collabs on Instagram that never went anywhere, and some unpaid consulting work for a friend's startup that never launched. Now, she called herself a content manager, which mostly meant she edited vacation photos for an influencer friend and reposted quotes about self-love and morning routines. And every time she did anything remotely productive, got a job, left a job, updated her LinkedIn, my parents treated it like she'd cured a disease. I still remember when she announced that she'd landed a brand partnership for a mattress company and posted a photo of herself jumping on a bed with her arms outstretched. My dad printed it out and framed it in his office. He told his coworkers she was in marketing. Meanwhile, I was finalizing a $2.3 million rebrand for one of our highest-earning properties and didn't even get a text. Every major milestone in my career passed in silence. When I moved into my first real apartment, a one-bedroom in a restored brownstone in Nashville with exposed brick and views of the skyline, I sent pictures to my family group chat. No one responded. When I bought my first car outright in cash, no loans, no cosigner, just a clean title with my name on it, my mom's only comment was, "I hope you didn't buy something too flashy." That's not very ladylike. I didn't even bother correcting her that I bought the black SUV because I was driving myself from state to state for site visits and needed the space to haul marketing kits and uniforms when my staff couldn't. When I got the promotion to regional director, I was in my office at the time, a temporary one set up in a corner suite of a hotel we'd just renovated. The senior VP had come down from New York to hand me the letter in person. He shook my hand and told me that I was the kind of leader the brand needed, someone who didn't ask for attention but deserved it anyway. That night, I went back to my room, ordered room service, and opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for something that felt like this. I sent a message to my mom, got promoted again. I'll be overseeing 14 properties now. Kind of a big deal. Her reply came 2 hours later. That's nice, sweetie. Did you hear Haley got featured on her friend's podcast? She gave tips on editing Instagram stories. I stared at my screen for a long time. Not angry. Not hurt. Just empty. It was like my successes didn't register. Like they couldn't even see them. Like no matter how high I climbed, I was still the daughter who worked too much, talked too directly, didn't wear enough makeup, and didn't smile in photos the way Haley did. But I kept going. I kept showing up. I kept collecting wins in silence. I paid my own bills, invested in my own retirement fund, built an emergency savings account, and learned how to fix the garbage disposal when it broke in my apartment because I didn't have anyone else to call. I was alone, but I was capable. And now, somehow, I was also the one quietly bankrolling Haley's wedding. The one they trusted to put down $52,000 without blinking. The one they assumed would handle it without making a fuss. Because that's what I did. I solved problems. I paid for things. I handled emergencies. And still, I wasn't the daughter they bragged about. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April when my phone rang, Mom's name on the screen, and for once, I hesitated before answering. We hadn't spoken in a while, not really. There'd been the usual exchanges, happy birthday texts, the occasional forwarded meme from her Facebook page, brief comments on family photos, but nothing real, nothing resembling a conversation between a parent and their adult child. I answered anyway, because some part of me still reacted instinctively, still wanted her voice to mean something. I pressed the phone to my ear, already bracing. She didn't even say hello. Just a shaky breath and then, Maddie, I didn't know who else to call. I froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition. That tone. That practiced panic that curled itself around her voice like smoke. She only used it when she wanted something big. What's going on? I asked, calm, even. My voice had been trained for this through years of managing hotel crises, flooded bathrooms, lost VIP guests, broken air conditioning units during wedding weekends in July. I knew how to keep it steady. It's Haley, she said, and of course it was. She's been dreaming about the Lauder since she was a little girl, ever since we went to that garden brunch there when she was 10. She's in love with it, Maddie. You should have seen her face when we toured it. Like magic. Her voice broke, like she was remembering a fairy tale. I already knew where this was going, but I let her get there on her own. She kept talking, her voice wobbling, then sharpening with urgency. But the deposit alone is more than we expected. And there's the catering minimum, the rentals, the valet package. We wouldn't be asking if we had another choice. I stood in my kitchen, phone wedged between my shoulder and cheek, a stainless steel saucepan in my hand, filled with cold pasta I'd been too tired to reheat. I looked around at the apartment I'd earned, rented on my own, furnished piece by piece with my bonuses and promotion checks, nothing gifted, nothing handed down. It was clean, modern, mine. And in that moment, none of it mattered. They didn't have another choice, not because of circumstance, but because of decisions they'd made years ago, decisions that always revolved around Haley. I knew the details. I knew about the down payment they put on her downtown condo when she graduated, a space far too big and too expensive for a girl who didn't hold a job longer than a few months. I knew about the white Mercedes with the red bow on top, presented to her on her 24th birthday with champagne flutes and a rented photographer to capture the moment. I knew about the Saks account Mom kept open under her name for emergencies, which Haley used for shoes, makeup, and $700 cardigans she'd wear once and leave crumpled on her closet floor. They'd spent everything for her, and now, there was nothing left. And yet somehow, it was still my responsibility to make her dream come true. I know it's a lot, Mom whispered, but you're in such a good place, Maddie. You've worked so hard. It's just one wedding. And it would mean everything to her. I should have said no. I should have pointed out the absurdity of the request, reminded her that I'd paid my way through college with scholarships and night shifts, that I'd lived in a studio apartment with 3 roommates and walked to work in the snow just to save on gas. I should have asked her why, after everything I'd built on my own, I was the one they turned to when their poor planning finally caught up with them. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "How much?" She paused. Maybe she was shocked I hadn't argued. Or maybe she was waiting for me to break, to beg her not to ask me. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, delicate, like she was handling glass. The full cost is about $75. We've paid the photographer and the florist, but we're still short about $52,000. I wrote the number down on a post-it note and stared at it, as if looking at it long enough would make it mean something else. $52,000 to fix a hole they dug themselves with smiles and credit cards, $52,000 to make Haley's dream come true, $52,000 to be handed over without thanks, without recognition, without anyone wondering how I'd gotten to a place where I even had that kind of money. "Okay," I said, and I heard Mom exhale like she'd been underwater. "I'll wire it tomorrow." The gratitude I expected didn't come. No tears. No declarations of how proud she was. Just a simple, "That's very generous of you, sweetie. Haley's going to be so excited." Not, "You're saving us." Not, "We're lucky to have you." Just another line in the long, unspoken script where I played the part of the reliable one, the capable one, the one who could always be called upon to clean up their mess. After we hung up, I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time. The apartment was quiet, just the low hum of the fridge behind me. My laptop was open on the coffee table, spreadsheets and reports glowing on the screen, proof of the life I'd built through sacrifice, through strategy, through doing everything the hard way. I wired the money the next day without another word. And maybe deep down, some small, stupid part of me still believed that this time, it would be different. That this time, they would finally see me. That I'd walk into that wedding and anyone, would look at me and realize I was the one who made it all possible. That maybe, at long last, I wouldn't be invisible. The rehearsal dinner was held on the rooftop terrace of the Lauder, the sky painted in that perfect warm dusk that photographers live for, and I stood there in a dress I'd worn 3 times before, because spending more money on this weekend felt like throwing water into a well that never filled. They had transformed the space, string lights draped overhead, white linens pressed sharp enough to cut, gold-rimmed glassware, candles flickering inside little crystal hurricanes. Every detail Haley had once pointed at on Pinterest was there in real life, paid for in full by the sister no one saw. I found my name on the place card at the far end of the table, tucked between Aunt Marlene, who was almost entirely deaf and spoke in a shout, and a groomsman whose face I barely recognized, already half glued to his phone, thumb scrolling through something far more important than the woman who helped fund his catered chicken and truffle potatoes. I sat down quietly and waited. No one looked up. I smiled politely when the server filled my glass and thanked him more warmly than anyone had thanked me all weekend. They passed around plates and shared stories and laughed too loudly at Haley's dramatic retellings of wedding dress fittings and how she knew from the beginning this was her fairy tale moment. I sipped my wine and picked at my salmon, chewing carefully, listening to the way the conversation moved like a wave that curled around me but never touched me. At one point, I tried to speak, just a small comment about the venue lighting, something I knew too much about, something I had personally coordinated through a supplier I had flown in from Charleston. No one responded. The groomsman next to me tapped harder on his phone, and Aunt Marlene cupped her hand around her ear and shouted, "What's that, darling?" as if I'd mumbled something from across a canyon. Then came the toast. My father stood, clearing his throat with theatrical gravity, raising a glass of champagne. The room quieted immediately. He beamed, handsome and polished, every inch the patriarch. He looked down at Haley and smiled that soft, glowing smile he reserved only for her. "To our pride and joy," he said, voice thick with warmth, "our beautiful Haley. You've always lit up our lives, and tomorrow, you'll walk into a new chapter with the same grace and light you've always carried. We couldn't be more proud." To Haley. Glasses clinked. Cheers echoed across the table. Someone started a slow clap that others joined. I sat perfectly still, fingers tight around the stem of my untouched glass. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. Not as a sister. Not as a bridesmaid. Not as the person who had cut the check that made this night physically possible. I didn't even exist in the toast. Not a single word. I waited until the applause died down and the servers came back around with dessert, then quietly got up and made my way inside. I didn't want to make a scene, didn't want attention, God forbid that. I just needed air. I stepped into the hallway off the terrace, heart pounding, breath shallow, and leaned against the wall covered in floral wallpaper, trying to process what had just happened. Not even anger. Just a dull, cold ache spreading in my chest like something going numb. A few minutes later, my mother followed me in, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. I turned as she approached, searching her face for something, concern, understanding, a trace of apology, but there was nothing but irritation. She crossed her arms and looked at me like I was being difficult. Why didn't he mention me? I asked, quietly, because even now, after all this, I still thought maybe she hadn't noticed, maybe it had been an oversight. Not even my name? She frowned. Madison, this weekend isn't about you. I blinked. I know that. But I helped. I made this possible. I paused, fighting the tightness in my throat. I just thought he might say something. Her expression hardened, mouth drawing into a thin line. Helping financially doesn't mean you get to make it about yourself, she snapped. This is Haley's moment. Let her have it. You always do this, you need to be recognized for everything. I stared at her, stunned. My mother. The woman whose mortgage I helped pay last year when Dad's investments dipped. The woman who sent me screenshots of bridal bouquet options at 1 a.m, asking which would photograph better. The woman who had cried on the phone 6 months ago, begging me to save this wedding. And now, she looked at me like I was selfish for wanting to be acknowledged. Like asking for a sliver of the spotlight I had funded made me ungrateful, needy. I'm not trying to take anything from her, I said, softly, slowly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. But I paid for this venue. That toast, those lights, this entire night, if I hadn't stepped in, none of this would be happening. She didn't flinch. That was your choice. I nodded once. That was it. Not even a thank you. Just cold logic. That was your choice. You paid, and now you expect something in return. That was how they saw me. Not a daughter. Not a sister. Not family. Just a resource. A line of credit with a heartbeat. That night, back in my hotel room, I lay in bed wide awake, the room too quiet and too bright at the same time. The blackout curtains didn't quite seal shut, and a thin strip of city light poured across the carpet like a fault line. I stared at the ceiling, my hands still resting on my stomach, dress unzipped but still on, too exhausted to move. The silence pressed down harder than anything anyone had said. I thought about every time I'd convinced myself that love was something you could earn. That if you gave enough, worked enough, sacrificed enough, they'd eventually have no choice but to see you. That one day, the equation would finally balance and I would be seen. Recognized. Chosen. But that night, lying alone in a room I had paid for in a hotel I had secured at a discount with my own industry clout, after a dinner I had financed, surrounded by people who still treated me like an afterthought, I finally understood. Love shouldn't have to be bought. And if it does, it's not love at all. The morning of the wedding felt like standing inside a snow globe, everything sparkling and fragile, the air too still, too curated. Behind the scenes of the Lauder's grand ballroom, in the bridal prep suite filled with makeup artists, curling irons, and bursts of nervous laughter, I stood in front of a full-length mirror and stepped into the bridesmaid dress Haley had selected for me without ever asking what I liked or what fit my body. It was dusty rose, the color of old makeup sponges and hotel lobby couches, with a neckline that pulled awkwardly across my chest and a waistline that hit in the wrong place. I'd had it tailored twice and it still didn't fit right. I'd said nothing. I didn't want to cause drama. The other bridesmaids twirled in their dresses, their curls bouncing, champagne flutes in hand. I offered to help zip one of them up, and she smiled vaguely like she didn't quite remember my name. The photographer moved through the suite snapping candids, lipstick being applied, shoes being buckled, perfume misting through the air, and I stayed out of frame, instinctively. When it was time for group photos, we were shepherded like dolls into the rose garden outside, surrounded by peonies and string quartets. The air was heavy with heat and hairspray. I stood with the other women, aligning myself quietly where the photographer pointed. Haley, in her strapless silk gown that had required 3 fittings and an emergency alteration last night, turned to me with a tight-lipped smile. "Madison, can you just step to the side a little?" she asked, gesturing vaguely to the edge. "You're kind of tall, and it's throwing off the symmetry." She said it in front of everyone. Loud enough that the makeup artist paused, that one of the groomsmen looked away. I felt all of it. Every eye. Every silent agreement. I said nothing. I moved. Each time the camera shutter clicked, I was further out of frame. First next to the edge. Then angled behind a bridesmaid's shoulder. Then, for one shot, standing entirely out of line, as if I wasn't part of the group at all. No one corrected it. No one told Haley she was being rude. The photographer barely looked at me, directing all his energy toward Haley's veil, Haley's smile, Haley's lighting. By the time we moved back inside to prepare for the ceremony, I felt like a ghost in Tulle. When the ceremony began, I stood exactly where I was told, smiled exactly when expected. I held my bouquet and kept my posture perfect. I clapped politely. I hugged who I was told to hug. I smiled for strangers, posed for pictures where my name wasn't remembered, and complimented a cake I'd tasted twice during the planning sessions because Haley couldn't decide between raspberry or vanilla. Then came dinner. I was walking toward the main ballroom with a few of the guests when I heard my mother's voice behind me, low, urgent. "Madison, wait." I turned. She approached with that tight smile she reserved for public spaces, her hand clutching a printed seating chart. "You're actually at table 12, she said, already turning the chart toward me, pointing to the far corner of the ballroom map. "Back right. Just to avoid any incidents." I stared at the spot she was indicating. "Near the exit. Next to the buffet station. Behind one of the decorative pillars. Practically out of sight." "Incidents?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She blinked, then smiled more brightly, like she was rewording in her head. "You know how sometimes things get tense. We just want today to go smoothly. You understand?" Yes. I understood perfectly. The message was crystal clear. I wasn't being seated near family. I wasn't sitting with the bridal party. I wasn't even close to the stage, where Haley and her new husband would make their speeches, cut the cake, and perform their heavily choreographed first dance. I had paid for the venue, the music, the lighting rig that made the chandeliers glitter like a movie set, and I was being tucked into a corner like a liability. Like a risk. Like someone who might make the day about herself by simply existing too close to the center. I walked to table 12 with my head held high and sat in the chair with my name card, carefully written in someone else's handwriting. The tablecloth was the wrong length. The centerpiece was smaller. No one else at the table knew who I was. I introduced myself with a smile and made polite conversation. No one asked me how I knew the bride. I didn't volunteer it. From where I sat, the wedding unfolded like a play on a stage I wasn't allowed to touch. Speeches were made. Laughter rose like smoke. Haley beamed and twirled and cried pretty, practiced tears. And every time someone glanced my way, it was like I wasn't there at all. Disappear. Be pretty. Be quiet. Be less. I'd followed those rules my whole life. And somehow, I was still too much. I slipped away from the ballroom sometime between the father-daughter dance and the second round of toasts, the room swelling with clinking glasses and low laughter, everyone basking in the warm afterglow of a celebration that had been scripted down to the last champagne pour. I didn't make an announcement, didn't excuse myself. I just quietly stood, stepped away from table 12, and walked the long hallway toward the guest suites, the walls lined with framed black and white photographs of old socialites and long-dead politicians smiling through perfect teeth. My shoes echoed too loudly. Everything felt too loud. Once inside my room, I kicked off the heels I hadn't broken in properly and sat on the edge of the bed, still in that dusty rose dress that clung too tightly and made me feel like I was playing a role I hadn't auditioned for. I stared at my phone in silence, the screen lighting up with nothing. No missed calls. No messages. No one wondering where I'd gone. I opened a text thread I hadn't touched all day. Rachel. Rachel, who had shared a bunk bed with me in a New York City summer sublet when we were both 21 and broke, who stayed up with me through finals and job applications and my first big client rejection. Rachel, who had celebrated every one of my victories louder than anyone in my own family. Rachel, who never let me apologize for being ambitious. I typed out the words quickly, thumbs moving before I could overthink it. They want me to blend in. Stay quiet. Again. I stared at the message after I hit send, heart tight, jaw clenched. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was the truth. It had been the truth for years. A quiet, suffocating truth I'd carried like a second skin. Her reply came back almost immediately, like she'd been waiting for it. You're not the person they see. You built your life from nothing. Don't let them shrink you. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I read it once, then again, and again after that, like my brain couldn't absorb it all at once. You're not the person they see. She didn't even ask for context. She didn't ask for proof or backstory. She knew. She had seen the version of me that no one else had, fighting through unpaid internships, pulling all-nighters for entry-level jobs, learning the language of corporate rooms where no one looked like us, all while still sending holiday cards to people who forgot my birthday. I stood up and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside to see the garden below. The string lights were glowing, casting golden halos over the lawn. Guests were filtering outside again, posing for photos, fixing their hair in the glass. Haley was standing in the center, surrounded, radiant, with that practiced tilt of her head that caught the light just right. I watched it all, this scene I had paid for, unfold without me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that a nap would fix, but the kind that seeps into your bones after carrying weight that was never yours to hold. My whole life, I had believed the problem was me. That I hadn't done enough, hadn't given enough, hadn't proven myself enough. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed helpful, stayed generous, that eventually they would love me in the way they loved her. I thought if I climbed high enough, earned enough, gave enough, that eventually someone would turn around and say, "We see you. We're proud of you." But it was never going to happen. Because it was never about what I did or didn't do. It was about what they had already decided I was. The supporting character. The fallback. The bank account. The responsible one who didn't need attention, didn't need praise, didn't need space. They hadn't forgotten to love me equally. They had simply chosen not to. And I had been trying to buy it back, year after year, with money, with patience, with silence. I let go of the curtain and sat back down, heart racing, not with grief but with something else, clarity. For the first time in a long time, I saw the full picture. Not through the lens of guilt or longing or self-blame, but through the simple, unvarnished truth, I wasn't invisible. I was being ignored. And there's a difference. Rachel's words sat on my screen like a lighthouse. Don't let them shrink you. I had already shrunk myself 100 different ways, changing how I spoke, how I dressed, how I reacted. I had downplayed my own milestones so I wouldn't make Haley feel bad. I had smiled through being excluded, diminished, forgotten. And for what? So they could keep pretending Haley's curated chaos was the center of gravity in our family? So I could sit at the back of a ballroom and quietly absorb the fact that my contributions only mattered when they came with a wire transfer? Tonight, I was done. Not in the angry, impulsive way I used to imagine when I was younger. Not with slammed doors or accusations or dramatic confrontations. I was done in the clean, quiet way that comes when you finally realize something important: their love was never mine to earn. Their approval was never contingent on my effort. They had chosen their golden child. They had made their hierarchy. And I was finally ready to stop trying to climb it. I was in the hallway outside the bridal suite, waiting for the hairstylist to finish with one of the other bridesmaids so I could finally sit down and have mine touched up. My curls had started to flatten from the heat and humidity, the back of my neck damp with sweat despite the Lauder's aggressively maintained air conditioning. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the door was cracked open, and my name was the first thing I heard. "Just make sure she doesn't talk too much," Haley's voice rang out, light and careless, full of the performative sweetness she reserved for her friends. "She always makes things about herself." There was a pause, and then soft laughter, muted and knowing. The kind of laughter that comes from people who believe they're in on something. I stood still in the hallway, staring at the framed photograph on the opposite wall, my reflection dimly visible in the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there and let the words settle like dust on skin. She always makes things about herself. Me. The one who hadn't spoken above a murmur all weekend. The one who had been shifted to the edge of every photo. The one who had been seated in the shadows. The one who had spent $52,000 of her own hard-earned savings to ensure this day even existed. And she had the audacity to say that I made things about myself? I backed away from the door before anyone saw me. My throat burned. Not with tears, those had dried up long ago, but with something colder, deeper. A kind of detachment. The kind you get when the final straw doesn't come in the form of screaming or chaos, but through a whispered betrayal you knew, deep down, had always been waiting. I didn't go back into the suite. I wandered down to the banquet corridor, where the catering team was setting up past hors d'oeuvres on mirrored trays, the scent of roasted garlic and champagne-soaked berries floating through the air. My heels clicked softly as I moved through the space, ignored by everyone, invisible even in a dress that cost more than my first car. I didn't belong to this world, not really. I had built it. Paid for it. Designed it. But I wasn't allowed to exist in it. I ducked into a side room and sat on a velvet bench near the wall, away from the bustle. I pulled my phone from my clutch, stared at the screen. No new messages. Of course not. Rachel's last text was still there, glowing like a lighthouse. Don't let them shrink you. I sat there, still as a statue, letting those words root deeper. Letting them settle into the place where years of longing used to live. And then the door opened behind me. My mother. She didn't knock. Just appeared, her lipstick too pink, her earrings swaying like tiny gold accusations. There you are, she said, a little breathless, a little annoyed. You're not hiding, are you? I didn't answer. I stood slowly, brushing non-existent lint from my skirt. Her eyes scanned me like they always did, top to bottom, checking for flaws. And then she said it. Don't eat too much at the reception. That dress is already tight. The air left my lungs for half a second. I looked at her, really looked at her. The mother who used to braid my hair when I was 7. The one who had stood in front of my 4th grade science fair poster and told the judges that I was going to run the world. Somewhere between then and now, she had decided I was easier to tolerate when I was silent, small, and out of the way. I could have said something. I could have let everything pour out. I could have screamed. I could have asked her how she could look me in the face, knowing I had paid for every flower she'd spent the morning photographing, every chandelier she'd bragged about to guests like she had picked it out herself, every bite of food she would soon pick it delicately while telling her friends it was just like the Four Seasons, only better. Instead, I smiled. Not fake. Not strained. Just a small, quiet smile. The kind you wear when you know something no one else does. A smile that isn't for them at all. Because I had a plan now. Not revenge. Not pettiness. Nothing loud or messy. Just a choice. A deliberate, final shift that had already started inside me the moment I heard Haley say what she said, the moment I realized my mother would rather comment on my waistline than acknowledge my worth. I didn't belong to them anymore. They never really wanted me to. They just wanted what I gave. My silence. My stability. My money. My presence when it was convenient, and my absence when it wasn't. But I had outgrown the role they'd written for me. I had rewritten it without even realizing it. Every step of independence, every raise, every sleepless night I spent building something real, those weren't acts of compensation. They were acts of liberation. And now, I was free. I walked past my mother without another word, her expression frozen in that half-frown of confusion. Let her wonder. Let them all wonder. Because I knew something none of them had figured out yet. I didn't need this wedding. They needed me. And they were never going to get me again. The ballroom glowed like a dream someone else was having. The chandeliers above threw glittering shadows across the polished floors, soft jazz hummed under the sound of forks scraping porcelain, and waiters in white gloves moved like choreography between tables, setting down plates of filet mignon and lobster tail. Every guest was basking in curated perfection, surrounded by velvet napkins, imported champagne, a 10-piece string ensemble. It was all seamless, elegant, grand. It was exactly what Haley wanted. It was exactly what I paid for. And I sat near the back, just behind a towering floral arrangement that blocked half my view, at table 12, the one by the emergency exit. They hadn't moved me. Not even after I wired over $52,000 of my own money. I had paid for the venue, the catering, the upgraded lighting, the security, the DJ, the champagne tower, the floral installation shaped like Haley's initials, and even the matching monogrammed robes for her and the bridesmaids. I had signed off on every invoice while they signed name cards. And now, I was being served a meal I had funded in a chair positioned like an afterthought, out of sight and out of mind. I barely touched my food. By now, I had stopped feeling hungry. Or even angry. It was something colder. A clarity that came from exhaustion, from betrayal repeated so often it became something smooth and solid inside you. Then the toasts began. The DJ quieted the music. A spotlight circled the head table. Haley beamed as her best friend took the mic first, her voice sugary and dramatic, gushing about how Haley always knew she was meant for magic and how she'd been the heart of our friend group since the 7th grade. Laughter, applause. Then another friend spoke, calling her the most radiant, generous, inspiring woman she'd ever met. And then my father stood. He didn't look nervous. He looked proud. Comfortable in this role, ready to perform the script of doting father with the gravitas only a man like him could summon. He held the microphone loosely, like he'd done this 100 times before. Haley, he began, voice thick with emotion, you've always been the light of our lives. From the moment you were born, we knew you were something special. You bring joy, warmth, and beauty into every room you enter. We're so proud of you. I waited. I watched. My name never came. Not once. Not even a passing reference to both my daughters. Not a vague, thank you to everyone who made this possible. Nothing. Just praise and pageantry for Haley. Just more of what I had always known but never wanted to admit in public, I didn't matter here. Not really. And yet, something inside me had shifted since that text from Rachel. Since the moment outside the bridal suite. Since my mother had looked me in the eye and told me not to eat too much. I stood up. No one noticed at first. The ballroom was full of noise, of clapping and clinking glasses, of the kind of easy, oblivious laughter that exists only in rooms where everyone believes they're on the inside of a celebration. I walked toward the head table slowly, my dress brushing against my ankles, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the music anymore. The DJ had just announced that anyone else who wanted to give a toast could now come forward. So I did. I stepped up onto the small stage, heels steady on the wood, and reached for the microphone. The wedding planner's assistant moved toward me instinctively, confusion flashing across her face, but I gave her a look that stopped her mid-step. When I turned to face the room, everything slowed. Hundreds of eyes. Haley's perfect smile frozen in place. My father, standing next to her, eyes already narrowing like he might stop me, but he didn't move. No one moved. I cleared my throat once. I wasn't going to speak tonight, I said, voice low but carrying. The room shifted. Murmurs, whispers. But after sitting through 2 hours of speeches about how this day came together by magic and love, I realized it's probably time someone said the truth. Dead silence. Everything you see tonight, every dollar, came from me. Gasps. A hand over someone's mouth. One of Haley's friends blinked rapidly. The Lauder Hotel. The catering. The flowers. The lighting. The champagne tower. The dress alterations. The DJ. The valet. All of it. I scanned the room slowly. $52,000. Wired from my personal savings account, 6 months ago, when my mother called crying because Haley's dream wedding was falling apart. I paid for this because I was told there was no other choice. I paid for this because I was told it would mean everything to her. I paid for this because I thought, maybe, finally, I'd be seen. My voice didn't tremble. No one thanked me. Not once. I was asked to stand to the side in every photo. I was told not to talk too much. I was warned not to eat too much. I was seated in the back of the room. And when my father stood here 10 minutes ago to speak about the light of his life, he didn't even say my name. I paused and looked at him. His face was stone. And that's okay. I turned to Haley. You got the day you wanted. The one I paid for. And now, I'm done. I won't be paying for anything else. Not weddings. Not mortgages. Not mistakes. Not silence. Not love. There were no words. No music. No polite applause. Just a stillness so thick it pressed into your skin. Haley's face had gone pale, her lips parted like she was about to speak but couldn't find the words. My father looked like someone had poured ice water into his suit. My mother stared at me with disbelief, but I didn't flinch. I set the microphone down gently on the table. It made a soft thud. Then I turned and walked off the stage, past the frozen expressions and the stunned silence, through the same hallway I'd walked earlier that day, but this time with my spine straight, my shoulders steady. For the first time in 25 years, they saw me. And they would never forget it. The moment I stepped down from that stage, the silence cracked like glass underfoot. It wasn't sudden, not all at once, it started with a single sharp inhale, then another, then the swell of murmurs rippling across the room in every direction, as if a stone had been dropped into still water and no one could look away from the splash. Silverware clinked against porcelain, someone dropped a fork, and a woman at a table near the front leaned over to whisper something urgently to the person beside her, her eyes wide with shock. I didn't flinch. I kept walking. My heels hit the marble with a rhythm I'll never forget, clean, even, deliberate. I walked back toward the table I had been assigned, table 12, though I didn't plan on staying long enough to sit again. I wasn't even halfway there before I heard my name. Madison. It was my mother's voice, pitched low and tight, the same tone she used when we were younger and she didn't want the neighbors to hear her snapping. She had already risen from the head table, her clutch in hand, moving quickly toward me with practiced grace and panic barely veiled behind her carefully painted face. Madison, we need to speak. Privately. I stopped. Turned. And looked her directly in the eyes. The murmurs dimmed again, like the room was holding its collective breath. No. Just that. One word. But it was more than I had ever given her in defiance. More than I'd given any of them. I watched the reaction bloom across her face, surprise, embarrassment, then the sharp flicker of anger she tried to mask with forced concern. This is not the time or place, she hissed through her teeth, as if she hadn't heard every word I'd said into that microphone 15 minutes earlier in front of 200 people and 1,000 candles. You're upset. You're making a scene. I smiled, but it wasn't for her. It was for me. No, I said again, louder this time, clear enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I'm not upset. I'm done. She stared at me like she didn't understand the language I was speaking. Because, maybe, for the first time, she didn't. For the first time, I wasn't softening my voice, wasn't measuring my words, wasn't negotiating my worth. I wasn't trying to be palatable or patient or polite. I wasn't offering explanations or begging to be heard. I was done. And then I turned toward my father. He was still seated, hands clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles white, face drained of the confident warmth he poured so freely into his toast to Haley. He didn't speak. He just stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. I was good enough to fund your fantasy, I said, my voice calm, even, deliberate, but never good enough to be your daughter. That landed harder than anything I'd said from the stage. I saw it in the way his jaw twitched, in the way his shoulders stiffened beneath his tailored jacket. But still, he said nothing. No denial. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just silence. Haley didn't even stand. She just sat there, frozen in the glow of the chandeliers, her bouquet still in her lap, her lips parted like she was mid-sentence in a conversation that had already ended without her. I scanned their faces one last time, mother, father, sister. People I had spent 25 years trying to earn, to help, to please. People who had looked right through me for decades while I twisted myself into the shape they needed, stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed useful. They had ignored every achievement, every sacrifice, every moment I needed them, and when I finally refused to be erased again, they didn't know what to do with me. So I gave them nothing more. No explanation. No softness. No, goodbye. I turned and walked out of that ballroom. Past the glittering centerpieces I paid for. Past the photographers snapping photos they would later crop me out of. Past the servers with trays of champagne I had selected during a tasting where I sat alone, pretending I was just helping, not funding. Past 100 stunned faces, some I knew, most I didn't, all of them watching me like I had broken a spell they hadn't realized they were under. No one stopped me. I pushed open the heavy doors, stepped into the corridor, and walked through the hushed lobby, the hem of my dress brushing marble. The soft music of the reception faded behind me. The building didn't collapse. No one ran after me. No arms reached out. Because that's how it had always been, I left quietly, and they let me. But this time was different. This time, they had seen me. Fully. Loudly. Publicly. And I didn't leave small. I walked out carrying nothing but myself. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the wedding wasn't a memory, it was a wildfire. My phone began buzzing around 6:30, long before I even opened my eyes. I tossed it onto the nightstand the night before without checking a single notification, the adrenaline still coursing through me after walking out of the ballroom. I'd barely slept. Not because I was anxious or second-guessing anything, but because for the first time in my life, I felt like I had unclenched something I'd been holding for years, and my body didn't know how to exist in the space that release had left behind. The screen was lit up when I turned over. Dozens of missed calls. Notifications stacked so high they blurred into one another. Group chats I'd forgotten I was in. People I hadn't spoken to since college. A few names I didn't even recognize. I blinked the sleep from my eyes, sat up slowly, and started scrolling. At first, I didn't understand what had happened. I assumed maybe word had spread among family, the typical whispering that follows any public moment that breaks the illusion. But then I saw it. My cousin Lacey, Haley's age, always the one with her phone out at family events, had posted a 45-second video on TikTok. Captioned simply, "Bridesmaid drops $52,000 truth bomb at wedding." It was my speech. Not the whole thing, but the part that mattered. The part where I stood, voice clear and calm, saying, "Everything you see tonight, every dollar, came from me, $52,000. Not a word of thanks. Not even a seat at the table. The comments were already in the thousands. People asking if it was real. People sharing their own stories. People tagging friends. Screenshots of my face mid-sentence, framed by flowers I had paid for, were now circulating online. Someone had posted a reaction video. Another person had uploaded a transcript. In less than 12 hours, I had become a story. And my family was scrambling. There were voicemails from my mother, strained, desperate. "Madison, call me. We need to talk about last night. It's not what you think." Another one from my father, clipped and cold, "You've made your point. Enough is enough." There were texts from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some pretending to check in, others fishing for details, more than a few outright accusing me of ruining the wedding. One message even came from Haley's college roommate, "I always knew something was off." Good for you. I didn't reply to any of them. I was still sitting in my hotel robe, sipping weak in-room coffee, when Rachel's name appeared on my screen. One simple text. "You were right. I'm proud of you." That was the one that made me exhale. I hadn't cried. Not at the wedding, not after the speech, not even when I walked out past 200 staring faces. But reading that message, those 6 words, I felt something loosen in my chest that I didn't know had still been tight. Rachel, who had never needed me to explain myself. Who didn't need a video to believe me. She had known all along. A few hours later, I got a call I didn't expect. Not from my parents. Not from Haley. It was Tyler's mother. She asked if we could meet. I hesitated, not because I feared confrontation, but because I wasn't sure if I had the energy to hear more apologies that weren't actually apologies. But something about her tone made me agree. We met in the hotel cafe, just after noon. She was already seated when I arrived, dressed in a conservative blouse, pearl earrings, and a look that was equal parts compassion and weariness. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said softly as I sat across from her. I nodded but said nothing. She leaned in slightly. "I know this might be strange, but I felt like I needed to say something to you. Something real." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. I've been watching Haley and your family over the last few months. I always suspected something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She would talk about wedding planning like it was some burden, some fairy tale being taken from her. But never once did I hear her mention your name. And then last night. Her eyes met mine. Clear. Direct. Now I know the truth. And I want to tell you something. I waited, unsure what was coming. You did the right thing, she said. You were brave. Not just for standing up and saying it, but for surviving everything that came before it without becoming bitter. Most people would have broken a long time ago. But you didn't. You carried the weight. And last night, you finally laid it down. Everyone sees it now. I didn't speak right away. I didn't trust myself to. Because the thing is, she wasn't just acknowledging the wedding. She was acknowledging the whole damn thing. The years of being sidelined. The subtle exclusions. The gaslighting. The endless, echoing silence that followed every success I had ever shared. She was telling me that I wasn't crazy for feeling like the air had always been thinner around my family, like love was something I had to rent by the hour and could never afford to own. When I finally did speak, my voice was steady. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. She nodded, finished her tea, and left me alone in that booth. The cafe was quiet. Muted sunlight spilled in through the windows. A couple 2 tables down whispered over their phones, watching the same video I knew had already racked up nearly 1 million views. And for once, I didn't feel the urge to hide or shrink or explain. I had spoken. The world had listened. And now, the silence was no longer mine to carry. They came back from their honeymoon 3 days early. It wasn't announced. There were no smiling airport photos, no matching beach outfits, no Instagram stories of tropical breakfasts or private infinity pools. Just silence, and then whispers. People started talking before their plane even landed. Tyler's family, once quietly pleasant, suddenly loud and deeply inquisitive, had started asking questions in circles Haley couldn't control. Where had the money come from? Why hadn't they known? Why was the woman who funded the wedding standing at the back of the room like an outsider? Why, in every clip that circulated, did Haley look frozen while I looked free? It didn't take long for Tyler to start pulling threads. I didn't follow the unraveling closely. I heard pieces, mostly through mutual acquaintances and the occasional headline in local society newsletters. His family demanded answers, and Haley's only defense, emotional manipulation, crocodile tears, a well-rehearsed script, fell flat outside the comfortable echo chamber of our family. Her stories didn't hold up in rooms full of sharp men with money and sharp women with memories. Tyler's trust in her crumbled quickly, and if there was any love left, it was buried under a landslide of lies and the humiliating realization that the wedding he'd bragged about had been propped up by the sister-in-law they treated like hired help. I didn't care. I didn't care when I heard they had cancelled the rest of the honeymoon. I didn't care when someone texted me a screenshot of Haley's private Instagram post that read, "People will always try to steal your light. Protect it." I didn't care when the first article appeared speculating on the Madison speech and what it meant for wealth, family, and gender dynamics in modern weddings. I didn't care when a cousin tried to drag me into a Facebook thread. I didn't care when one of Haley's old bridesmaids messaged me a half-hearted, "Hope you're okay." Because I was okay. More than okay. After the speech, I changed my number. My parents called once, just once. My mother left a voicemail, her voice trembling in that performative, exhausting way she used whenever she wanted to stitch guilt and blame into the same sentence. She started with, "We never meant to hurt you," and ended with, "But you really embarrassed the family," as if those two things could ever cancel each other out. I deleted the message without listening to the middle. I didn't call back. I didn't answer the follow-up email either. Instead, I started therapy. I walked into a room with no floral arrangements, no expectations, no roles I had to fill, and I told a stranger the entire story. Not just the wedding, but all of it. The childhood Christmas mornings where Haley got the camera and I got the socks. The way they bragged about her community college social media internship while ignoring my regional promotions. The way my father always stood with one arm around her and his other hand in his pocket when he spoke of his daughters. All the times I held my tongue when what I wanted was acknowledgement. All the years I worked twice as hard to be half as seen. And she listened. Every week, she listened. And every week, I peeled another layer off myself that I didn't know wasn't mine to begin with. I started spending more time with the people who had always seen me. Rachel came to visit twice in those first few months, and we sat on the balcony of my apartment drinking wine, laughing too loud, talking about the future in a way that felt possible again. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected while working overtime to earn a family that never wanted to be earned. I let myself say no to things without guilt. I learned to cook for pleasure. I started taking walks in the evenings without a phone call filling the silence. I bought flowers for myself. Work thrived. With the distraction of my family gone, my energy funneled into something solid. I led a multi-property operations overhaul in my region, introduced sustainability measures that actually cut costs, and finally pitched the proposal I'd written 2 years ago but never had the nerve to present. By the end of that fiscal year, I was promoted to Vice President of Operations. I celebrated alone, not because I was lonely, but because I chose it. I ordered my favorite meal, opened a bottle of Real champagne, and toasted myself, not to success, but to freedom. 6 months later, I bought a house. It wasn't huge. But it had a garden. A real one. With dirt that clung to my fingers and sunlight that cut through the windows just right at 7:30 a.m. on weekends. I planted rosemary and lavender and a climbing vine I couldn't pronounce but loved anyway. I bought a blue ceramic watering can. I hosted small dinners on the back patio. I laughed, freely, loudly. No shadows. No scripts. The family, meanwhile, began to quietly fracture. Their reputation, so carefully curated in social circles where holiday cards doubled as resumes, started to unravel. Friends went quiet. Invitations stopped arriving. My father's business contacts dried up, not from malice but from awkwardness. No one wanted to be associated with a story they couldn't control. The truth had gotten too big, too public, and they didn't know how to reframe it. Haley, once the gleaming centerpiece, became something pitted. Too many people had seen too much. Even Brooke's marriage, the cousin who used to call me extra, started to publicly strain. Her husband, it turns out, didn't like being associated with scandal. They were working on things, which was code for, we've stopped posting together. But I didn't gloat. Because I didn't need to. I wasn't focused on what was breaking behind me. I was focused on what I was building in front of me. A life that didn't revolve around being needed, or proving, or enduring. A life that didn't begin and end with someone else's expectations. Peace doesn't arrive like a wave. It comes quietly, in steady pulses. In the silence of a phone that no longer rings with demands. In a chair by a window where the light hits your skin and no one tells you to move. In the softness of a Sunday morning where no one asks you to show up for them before you've shown up for yourself. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just have peace. I had chosen it. The house is quiet in a way that doesn't feel empty, it feels earned. I wake slowly, the sunlight filtering through linen curtains, the shadows of tree branches dancing across the hardwood floor. I walk barefoot through the hallway, coffee warm in my hands, and it still catches me sometimes, this life that belongs completely to me. The garden outside hums with soft rustles, a breeze bending the rosemary slightly, the lavender still clinging to the morning's chill. And as I step out onto the back patio and sit down, legs tucked beneath me, I think of that night. Not the chaos. Not the aftermath. Just that moment at the mic. It doesn't play in my mind like a victory speech. It never was. It wasn't crafted for applause, and it wasn't designed to shame. It wasn't revenge. It was release. That moment, the microphone cold in my hand, the silence pulsing through 200 stunned bodies, my own voice rising not out of rage but out of clarity, was the first time I ever truly told the truth without shrinking it. I didn't speak to punish. I spoke because silence had become too heavy. Because I realized, in that precise instant, that I wasn't holding a grudge. I was holding grief. The grief of decades spent trying to be good enough for people who only looked my way when they needed something. I didn't destroy my family. I just stepped out of the illusion that their love was something I had to earn. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped carrying the weight of people who never once looked down to notice I was drowning. All those years, I had mistaken obligation for love, tolerance for acceptance, proximity for closeness. But love doesn't need receipts. Love doesn't wait to be bought or begged for. And the moment I said, no more, was the moment I finally saw myself not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who walked through fire and came out unscorched because she stopped asking to be invited into rooms that were never built to hold her. Sometimes I think about how long it took me to see it. How deeply that lie had rooted itself into my bones. How many promotions I celebrated alone. How many times I edited myself to be more digestible. How many dinners I paid for in exchange for nothing more than a seat at the edge of the table. How often I turned my hurt inward because admitting they didn't care felt too final. But not anymore. Now, I walk through my home, sunlight touching every corner, the air filled with nothing but stillness and space. I run my fingers over the books I chose, the art I hung, the furniture I arranged not to impress anyone but simply because it made me feel calm, or grounded, or whole. I spend my Sundays in the garden, pruning vines, tending to herbs, watching things grow because I fed them with care, not because they owed me something in return. That night didn't end anything. It didn't ruin a family or detonate a wedding or fracture a bond that had once been whole. It exposed what had always been broken. Quietly, undeniably. And it was never the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life built not out of duty or performance, but out of choice. The beginning of boundaries spoken and held. Of friendships nurtured. Of peace chosen again and again in small, intentional ways. It was the beginning of loving myself without waiting for permission. Of waking up without dread. Of existing without apology. I didn't walk out of that ballroom to prove anything. I walked out because I finally knew I didn't have to stay. And now, a year later, I can sit in my own garden, on my own land, in my own stillness, and know with every quiet, steady beat of my heart, that moment was never about them. It was the first time I chose me.